The evening sun cast long shadows through the forest as Aria stumbled exhausted along the overgrown trail. Her aching, blistered feet protested every step after hours of hiking. She longed to rest but couldn't risk getting stranded out here alone after dark. When a weathered wooden sign announced Briarwood Swamp 1 mile, Aria sighed in relief. Civilization was near. With renewed energy, she quickened her pace, the swamp visible through breaks in the foliage. Almost there. Without warning, the soggy ground gave way beneath her feet. Aria shrieked as she plunged into a hidden bog, icy water flooding her boots. Gasping from the shock, she flailed and frantically grasped at willow roots to haul herself out. But the more she struggled, the deeper she sank into the putrid muck, its sticky suction pulling her down like tar. Within moments, she was submerged to her waist, mired and immobile. "Help!" Aria screamed, her voice reverberating through the trees. "Somebody, please!" Only eerie silence greeted her desperate pleas. She was utterly alone, entombed in this repulsive swamp. Panic set in as she clawed at the muddy water, but her efforts only made her sink faster. The swamp seemed to swallow her with malicious glee, eager to claim another victim. Gripped by terror, Aria sobbed and shivered violently, slimy gunk oozing into her clothes. Her skin crawled at the thought of what vile creatures might be slithering beneath the opaque surface. Each labored breath drew the putrid stench deep into her lungs, making her gag. "This can't be how it ends," she whimpered. "Not like this." Time slowed to a surreal crawl as dusk painted the sky in vivid streaks of orange and red. Aria watched a graceful thrush land on an overhanging branch, envying its freedom. If only she had wings to escape this wretched mire. The thrush cocked its head inquisitively, studying her with beady eyes. "I don't suppose you could fetch help?" Aria laughed bitterly, despair fraying her mind. Talking to birds, she must be losing it. To her amazement, the thrush fluttered down and perched on a moldy log near her shoulder. In its beak was a scrap of crumpled paper. The bird deposited it carefully on the log and took flight with a triumphant trill. With great effort, Aria stretched her mud-caked arm and snatched up the curious note. She unfolded it with trembling hands, blinking to focus through tears and grime. Scrawled in faded ink was a single word: trust. Aria stared uncomprehending at the cryptic message. Trust? Trust in what? What could it possibly mean? She crumpled the damp paper in frustration. But as she raised her eyes, Aria gasped. The evening sky had transformed into a spectacular celestial display. Twin suns blazed amidst a panorama of colorful planets and nebulae. The luminous orbs cast a golden glow across the swamp, creating dazzling reflections on this. An inexplicable peace washed over Aria, stilling her racing thoughts. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe trust meant surrendering control, yielding to forces beyond her understanding. With a shuddering sigh, Aria felt herself sink a few inches deeper but resisted the instinct to fight it. She focused on the gentle breeze on her face, the water lapping at her chest, the distant birdsong. Time seemed to unspool. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the mud's iron grip began to loosen. Aria hardly dared to breathe as she felt the suction release with a soft, sucking sound. Experimentally, she wiggled her toes inside her waterlogged boots. They moved. With heart pounding, Aria carefully shifted her weight, pulling one leg free, then the other. The swamp yielded her like a bizarre birthing, water streaming off her mud-encased body. On shaking limbs, she crawled onto a tree root and clambered to mostly solid ground. For a long moment, Aria sprawled on a bed of moss, chest heaving with relieved sobs that racked her body. She wasn't sure if she had just experienced a miracle or a psychotic break, but she was alive. Filthy, exhausted, and overwhelmed, Aria almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. rescued from a ravenous swamp by a mysterious bird and a message telling her to trust. It sounded like something out of a fantasy novel. She half expected a wizard to pop out from behind an oak tree. With the crisis past, Aria took stock of her pitiful condition. She was drenched, shivering, and caked in foul-smelling muck from head to toe. Her stomach grumbled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Spitting out a mouthful of gritty water, Aria pulled herself to her feet with a groan. Every joint ached in protest, and her legs trembled like a newborn foal's. She probably looked like some kind of grotesque swamp monster. Picking her way carefully through the darkening forest, Aria tried to get her bearings. If she could just reach the road, she could follow it to the ranger station a few miles from the trailhead. They would have a phone she could use to call for help. But as night fell in earnest, even that simple plan fell apart. The swamp seemed to have swallowed the trail too, leaving no recognizable landmarks. Aria soon found herself hopelessly disoriented in the pitch blackness, tripping over roots and slogging through ankle-deep mud. At last, thoroughly lost and too tired to go on, Aria slumped against a tree trunk. She was so cold her teeth chattered and her muscles spasmed uncontrollably. Curling into a miserable, mud-caked ball, she closed her eyes and prayed for dawn. A strange, lilting melody wove through Aria's uneasy dreams, an ephemeral soundscape of rustling leaves, trilling birdsong, and burbling water. She followed the tantalizing notes down twisting paths dappled in amber light until she emerged in a sun-drenched glade. At its center sparkled an ethereal pool. Here the music crescendoed into a symphonic tapestry as a flock of luminous birds spiraled out of the crystalline depths. The thrush led the airborne dance, looping and diving in joyous exultation. An irresistible lightness buoyed Aria as she watched the avian. With a sharp gasp, she startled awake, the transcendent peace shattered. Gray dawn seeped through the dense canopy, casting the swamp in a ghostly pall. But the haunting melody still echoed in Aria's mind, an insistent tug she couldn't ignore. Hauling herself upright on stiff limbs, she slogged in the direction the dream birds had flown. At first, Aria thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The same fallen log, the same gnarled stump, over and over in an endless loop. But then, like a miracle, an incongruous flash of color, a simple wooden sign with a faded painted arrow. Briarwood Swamp Scenic Overlook, it proclaimed, though any path was long lost to the... With a choked sob of relief, Aria dragged herself up the eroded embankment, following the arrow. Her head spun and her stomach roiled as she reached the summit, but the view drove the breath from her lungs. From the high ridge, the swamp stretched out in a primeval sprawl to the horizon, draped in billowing skeins of spectral mist. Skeletal cypress trees clawed at the pewter sky from spongy hummocks and dark, sinuous channels. An air of ancient mystery, and arcing across it all, straddling land and water and sky, shimmered a glorious rainbow, its hyper-saturated hues almost too vivid to be real. It blazed with all the radiant beauty of Aria's dream, making her eyes sting with fresh tears. She didn't care if it was a hallucination conjured by her battered mind. In that transcendent moment, the swamp's terrors sloughed away, replaced by childlike wonder. Aria wanted nothing more than to plunge back into that enchanted morass and lose herself in its primordial depths. Sinking to her knees in the sodden earth, she let the swamp's siren song wash over her. Something had fundamentally shifted inside Aria, a tectonic plates of her soul realigning. Faced with her own mortality, the artificial edifice of her busy, buttoned-up life had crumbled, stripping her. She didn't know who that essential self was yet, but she yearned to find out with every fiber of her mud-caked being. Aria sensed it would be a long and arduous journey, full of wrong turns and switchbacks. But in a world boasting such exquisite beauty alongside such harrowing darkness, how could she not try? The rainbow started to fade as quickly as it had materialized, its magic seeping back into the ether. Shivering as a chill wind snaked under her ruined clothes, Aria forced herself back to immediacy's warmth, food, contacting help. She needed to rejoin, but she would return to probe the swamp's secrets, to plumb her own uncharted depths. A mere taste of its sublime mystery had rewritten her inner landscape, imprinting itself on her DNA. The wild called to a new wildness in Aria's heart, and she vowed to answer. Entrusting her fate to instinct, Aria aimed herself at the rising sun and walked. Her legs moved with dreamlike detachment, leaden with fatigue. She barely noticed the minor cuts and bruises from bulling through the underbrush, so coated was she in numbing muck. An incalculable time later, she stumbled out onto blessed asphalt, nearly weeping at the sight of blessed yellow lines. By some miracle, Aria's waterlogged phone sputtered to life long enough for her to dial 911 before the battery icon winked out. Awareness returned in snatches, siren wails, a blurry parade of concerned faces, the blissful warmth of a shock blanket. People kept asking her questions, but Aria couldn't seem to form words, her tongue thick and clumsy in her cottony mouth. "Trust," she managed to rasp as the ambulance's rear doors swung shut. Then the swamp's lullaby rose up and carried Aria away on a feather-light current, the thrush's wings beating in time with her own steady heart. A dreamless sleep, deep and blessedly mud-free. She awoke in a cocoon of sterile hospital white, and 4 lines snaking into the back of her hand. Aria greedily sucked down cup after cup of cool water as the doctor explained her condition: moderate dehydration. An older nurse brought Aria a cup of savory broth, concern creasing her face as she studied Aria's cracked lips and haunted eyes. The nurse patted Aria's arm with a warm, calloused hand. "You've been through quite an ordeal, honey. It's a miracle you made it out of that swamp in one piece. Big Cypress Briar is one of the most treacherous patches of wetland in the state. Many who go in, well, they don't come out again." The nurse nodded at the tattered remains of Aria's clothes heaped in the corner, stiff with dried mud. "Looks like you took a heck of a nosedive. I imagine you cut quite the figure stumbling out of there. Rather like a golem. Probably gave a few early morning motorists a terrible fright." Aria managed a wry snort. "I suppose I did look like some kind of swamp monster. The only reason I made it was..." She trailed off, brow furrowing as she plucked at a loose thread on the blanket. "This is going to sound crazy, but a bird helped me." To her relief, the nurse just smiled, not a trace of judgment in her warm hazel eyes. "Oh, I've heard stranger things. Believe you me, there's a lot of old magic in that swamp. The line between worlds gets a bit thin in liminal places like that." The nurse leaned closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "Legend has it that those cypress groves are home to all manner of fantastical critters, sprites and pixies, will-o'-the-wisps, even a talking catfish who grants wishes to the pure of heart." Aria shivered with a frisson that had nothing to do with her drying hair. The nurse's words resonated in her buzzing brain like a bell, making the whole improbable ordeal feel solid and real. Not a fever dream after all, but a true brush with the numinous. "Trust," she whispered, a slow smile blooming across her face. The swamp had tested Aria to her limits and beyond, forcing her to draw on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. It had taught her to find grace and beauty in the depths of... In the days that followed, Aria pored over every scrap of information she could find on Big Cypress Briar Swamp. She quickly discovered the nurse's tales barely scratched the surface of the wetlands' mysteries. The more Aria learned, the more her yearning grew. Locals whispered of a secret society, the Order of the Thrush, who communed with the swamp spirits and safeguarded their alien ways. Of spectral lights in the depths of the forest and haunting music on the night wind. Of people irrevocably changed after a night in the swamp's embrace. As soon as she was discharged, Aria knew where she needed to go. Ignoring her mother's objections, she bought a train ticket to the nearest town. She understood her parents' concerns, but she couldn't turn her back on the enigma. Big Cypress Briar Aria's return to the swamp had an air of pilgrimage as she retraced her steps along the overgrown trail. This time she was prepared rain boots, a thick coat, a packed lunch and survival kit. She would meet the wetlands' wildness on its own terms. To her surprise, Aria found she was no longer afraid as she faced down the dark maw of the forest. The swamp felt like an old friend now, its rhythms and secrets as familiar as her childhood home. She breathed in its earthy perfume like incense, peat moss, and petrichor. Picking her way carefully through the glossy tangle of undergrowth, Aria soon reached the spot where she'd been mired that fateful day. She expected a visceral surge of remembered dread, but only calm pervaded her. The memory felt oddly distant, like something that had happened to another person in a storybook long ago. Kneeling at the brackish water's edge, Aria dipped her fingers in the mirrored surface, watching the ripples dissolve her reflection. She thought of all the versions of herself subsumed over the years. The shy kindergartner, unfurling her fist, revealed the crumpled scrap of paper, impossibly preserved. The thrush's message shone up at Aria in stark black ink. Trust, such a small word to hold such profound power. Aria reverently pressed the note to her lips, then released it into the swamp with a gentle breath. She watched it bob and twirl on the current until it vanished in the purple shadows. An offering and a promise. Closing her eyes, Aria felt the swamp's presence envelop her like an embrace. Not the suffocating submersion of before, but a sublime dissolution, an ecstatic merging with mud and water and rustling leaves. Her boundaries grew porous and expansive until she became the swamp, and it became her. For an eternal moment, Aria was the thrush spiraling through its luminous canopy, the ancient cypress presiding over primordial mysteries, the quicksilver minnows darting through labyrinthine channels. She was the glorious riot of life and death and decay and rebirth. Endlessly, with a ragged gasp, Aria's eyes flew open, the transcendent communion severed. She fell back on her elbows, chest heaving as if surfacing from a deep dive. The swamp chittered and burbled around her, suddenly alive with 1,000 secret songs. Aria understood now that she could never truly leave this place. It had seared itself into her cells, rewriting her very molecules. The thrush's lodestar would forever guide her path, its sublime message etched on her heart. Trust in the journey, shaky but resolute, Aria pushed to her feet, dusting off her muddy jeans. She had a long road ahead of her, winding and treacherous as the swamp itself. But she would walk it with newfound grace, an initiate of the ancient mysteries. The city would feel like an ill-fitting costume after her time in the wetlands womb. The fluorescent lights and asphalt and clamoring demands would chafe her raw. But Aria would learn to balance her dual worlds, the mundane and the mystical, to weave her own incandescent reality from the muck of the everyday.